So this is art of the deal, and basically, this is like, once you're under contract or right when you're going under contract, we're gonna talk around all of the parts of the deal there. So here are our goals. Understand the basic timing requirements in a contract, become aware of forms that may be part of the deal. Understand like components of the deal, and then like, does anyone have a specific goal or a specific question they wanna cover today? If so, these classes are so much better when you guys talk and share and contribute because you have like real life experiences. So don't be shy. But this is what we're going to go over quickly. Is just the different components and parts of the deal that you as an agent need to kind of understand. So this is the title commitment. And what you're looking at here is this is just the cover page, the binder, I think they call it. This is the Schedule A. The title commitment has A, B, C, and D. Schedule A is all of the information about the property. It shows what's the purchase price, who is the buyer, who's proposing to be insured, is there a lender policy that's going to piggyback on top? And generally speaking, you know, whoever pays for the title policy, the main policy is negotiable between buyer and seller, but the buyer pays usually for the piggyback policy, which is for the lender, which is cheap if they're getting a main policy. And then this down here, it says who the title is currently held by. So you always want to make sure that that's actually the seller. And then the legal description of the land. So any questions about that? Okay. So then this is Schedule B, and what Schedule B is that this is what your B is for buyer. Like this is what the buyer needs to look at because these are all of the things that are not going to be covered by their policy. So, you know, 2 through 9 are boilerplate, and then 1 is going to say, you know, any restrictive covenants, like if there's when they originally recorded the deed or what have you. And then 10 is going to be policies that are exceptions that are specific to the property, right? And you just need to look there and make sure that there's nothing that the buyer doesn't like. Like if there's a huge utility easement across the middle of the property and the buyer wants to build a pool, like that's a problem. So Schedule B shows exceptions that the buyers are not going to have coverage to. So when they get their policy, it'll be a policy that also specifically said like you don't have coverage for these items. Questions about that? Okay. Schedule C is all of the items that the seller will need to remove, all of the items that will be removed prior to closing between the seller and the title company, right? So like if the seller had a loan, that's going to show up on there, and obviously that needs to be paid off so that clear title can be delivered to the buyer. It will also be, so it'll be things that are specifically attached to the property that need to be cleaned up, like liens and loans. Then there might also be personal things like tax liens or judgments against the seller, et cetera, et cetera. And that stuff all will need to be paid off and cleared prior to closing so that the buyer gets clear title. And then D is for like disclaimers. It's just basically disclosures about the title company. There's nothing really specific on there that you need to look at. Okay.
Hey, Zareen,
Mm-hmm.
I had an issue where there was a divorce and they needed to see the decree of the divorce and what was going on because her name was actually originally still on the house in the DCAD, but she didn't own part of the house because of the degree.
Yeah, so Texas has very generous, I would say, like community property and like homestead rights. So if at any point during the marriage, even if one spouse like owned it independently, if they live there as their marital homestead, the other partner like may have rights. So if just as a listing agent, just perk your ears up that if this was a home that they ever lived in when they were divorced, like that is probably something that they're going to need to see as the decree. So all of this stuff none of this stuff is like a deal breaker, but you just have to be aware. And as an agent, you should be savvy to think, let's get in front of that and let's like deliver it to the title company early so that they can review. Because I always say it's one thing for us to sign a listing agreement with the seller and then realize like, oh, we need someone else to sign on behalf of the seller or something like that. It's a totally different thing for us to get into a contract with a buyer and then realize we don't have the right signatories or the right people who are willing to sell the property like on the seller side. So we need to get that stuff taken care of in advance. Does that make sense?
And Zareen, it was really scary because up till the last moment, we couldn't get the wife to sign off.
Yes.
And so
exactly.
it was very scary because we thought the whole deal, and he literally had to sign other stuff and give her stuff to get her to sign this.
Yeah. It's like negotiation and leverage, and even if people have like a settled divorce decree, if they have kids, there's still always probably gonna be arguments happening, and so you have to be careful in those situations, for sure. It's a good example. Okay, so the next piece is obviously like the survey, and these are two different surveys of properties. This one's a little bit older, but the survey is gonna show, you know, what all is encumbering the property, like is there a setback? Where are the fence lines? Is there an issue, et cetera, et cetera? And then the buyer can see like, oh, there's a, I'm looking for one right here. There's a gas meter right here, so I can't build anything there, obviously, and then there's a setback line as well. So it just gives the buyer like the overview of what the property looks like, and they need to look at it. This is not, I have to always say as a caveat, like I know we want to be full service and do everything for our clients, but also at some point, like the buyer, the clients have to have some responsibility in the situations, and they need to look at this stuff as well. You don't want to be the person who's like translating everything for them and they're totally clueless, because then it's on you, right? So you have to work, we manage the process, they manage the decisions, right? Like it's our job to educate, which means we have to be knowledgeable. Okay, so in the contract, you know, paragraph 6C relates to the survey, and you have a few different choices. You know, if there's an existing survey like the two I just showed you, you can say within, you know, blank days, 3, 2, 1, 5, whatever. Seller shall furnish to buyer and title company their existing survey and a residential real property affidavit, the T47. So notice here in bold and conspicuous language, if seller fails to furnish the existing survey or affidavit within the time prescribed, buyer shall obtain a new survey at seller's expense. So it's automatic. If you haven't delivered that in time, like the buyer's agent has the right to call the title company and say, order us a new survey and put it on the seller. And typically what happens is that it's really put on the seller's agent, right? Because they didn't get this stuff done in time. And sellers don't know these dates in this contract like we do. Like that's why they're hiring us. So that's why at Briggs Freeman, it's our best practice to get the survey, make the seller find the survey, get the T47 notarized during the listing process. And then you have it, and there's like no concern that you're gonna have to pay for a new survey. Does that make sense? How many of you guys do
Yeah.
that? Yes, so it's the only way to do it. And then, you know, who's gonna pay for it if for some reason it's not acceptable, if it's very old and hard to read, or if there have been a lot of changes since the survey, the underwriter of either the title company or the lender may say, we want a new one, and then who's gonna pay for it? Again, this is another reason to get it in advance, show it to the title company and say, are you guys okay with this? In advance. So, and then within blank days after the effect, then if they don't have an existing one, it's like, who's getting the new one? And generally speaking, I would say if you're on the buy side, you don't want to get a new one until you're past the option, because you don't want to order a survey, be on the hook for the, you know, $500 to $700 that it costs, and then decide you're terminating. So I would put this, if your option is 5 days, I would put within 6 days, and then on the 6th day, or have the title company order the survey. So one thing that I like to say is that I'll get on my Zerine soapbox about this. If you're dealing in these huge, not huge, these are huge assets for people, right? It's probably people's single largest asset, especially when you guys get like to really high price points. Like your buyer should probably want a new survey if the survey's not very new. Like if there's any changes or if the survey's old, I would recommend getting a new survey and having the buyer pay for it, because then they have privity of contract with the survey company if the surveyor makes a mistake. And also it just makes your title policy that much stronger because the policy references the survey. Does that make sense? That's my recommendation. I don't understand why someone would buy a $2 or $3 or $4 million property and not want to pay like $700 for a new survey that makes their policy stronger and will show them the current state of the property versus something old that's been passed around several times. What's up, Emily?
I have a quick question on that, on the survey. You know how in the contract, there's the box to click for the will cover shortages,
Yes, well, we will get there, but yes.
but it does cover survey mistakes, is my understanding. So I guess my question is, do you have to have a new survey for that to even work?
No, you don't have to have a new survey for it to work, but a newer survey is better. So I would recommend doing it.
So even if you click the shortages in the area, it would cover mistakes in an older survey. Is that correct?
Well, it depends what you mean by, like, you mean mistakes or you mean a change?
Well, my understanding is that the shortages in the area covers any sort of mistakes that a surveyor may make, and maybe I've been misinformed on that.
Well, it's not, well, it's probably mistakes, but it's also like things that have changed. Let's wait until we get there, because we're
Okay.
gonna look at that language, okey doke. In fact, it might be next. No, it's not next, but we will get there. Okay, so this is the T47. And again, this is not y'all's responsibility. Obviously, you can fill out the name, this information, state of Texas, right? And it says we're the property owners, we're familiar with the property. We're closing a transaction requiring title insurance in the proposed blah, blah, blah. This saying this is why we're doing this. To the best of our knowledge, since blank date, and this date here needs to be the date on the survey. Right? I know a lot of people put the date they bought it or today's date. The date that the title company needs to see here is the actual date of the survey. Because then you're going to go down and say, since that date, there haven't been any changes except for these. And so then you might say, oh, we added a pool, or we added a fence, or we moved the flower bed, or we changed the driveway. And then you say the changes. So that what the title company and the lender are looking at then is the survey plus the affidavit from the seller that says any changes that aren't shown on this survey. Does that make sense?
Zareen, what number is that? I can't
It's
get my
right-
screen big enough.
It's on 4, it's in paragraph 4, where it says, to the best of our knowledge, since this date, since the date of the
Okay.
survey that we're looking at, there have been no construction projects, no changes, nothing, no replats, nothing, except for this. And then it's like, I had, like in my very first deal I ever did, I had the survey from when they bought it. And then we got to the closing table and the seller was like, oh, there's not a hot tub there anymore. And so we had to say, except for like removed the hot tub, right? Now, luckily that was not an issue, but he should have put, except for, removal of the hot tub. That was
What
shown on
if,
the survey.
what if the majority of landscaping was taken out and redone? Does that,
Well, I mean, you're not, look, these are the things that they
you're not
want.
changing?
You're not
anything,
changing
really.
boundaries. If you're building a huge retaining wall to add new landscaping, you probably want to include that. If you're just like, that, the landscaping isn't shown on the survey, but like major boundaries are, right?
I understand.
Yeah, so stuff like that. Okay, so that's how they fill that out. And again, you don't need to fill it out, but you need to explain to them how to fill it out, right?
Mhm.
Okay. Any questions there, guys? Okay. So, Emily, I'm wondering about that language in the contract. We'll come back to it. Don't let me forget. Okay, so the next piece is home warranties. What is a home warranty? It's a service agreement for 1 year that covers repair and replacement of systems. It's different than your homeowner's insurance, right? Because homeowner's insurance is damage and loss by unexpected events, but it's not, you can't call your homeowner's insurance when your dishwasher breaks or when the air conditioning breaks, right? So that's the difference. And then what does it cover, right? We have preferred partners that are home warranty companies. Hopefully you guys are in touch with the reps, because I think that's the best way to get the most value out of your home warranty is to have an actual person that you can deal with when things go wrong. So anyway, any questions about this? This is pretty straightforward. Obviously, the buyer chooses which home warranty company that they want, and they let the title company know, and the title company will order it. Okay, so what's an HOA? An HOA is an organization in a subdivision or a community that makes and enforces rules for the properties and the residents. If you're buying a property in an HOA, what your buyer needs to understand is that they are, they're basically buying like membership in like a jointly owned space, the communal space, right? And so they own their property, but they're also subject to the shared ownership of the community. And that's just something they need to understand. So an HOA has a board that oversees the rules, and then the rules are described in the CC&Rs, which is what those HOA documents are. So when you go, when you have a property that's in an HOA, what you're going to get when you get the HOA documents is you're going to get the CC&Rs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions, which is like the HOA documents. Plus you're going to get a resale certificate, and a resale certificate is the document that the HOA board has to fill out that gives the buyer a snapshot of what is the current state of the HOA. Are there any lawsuits? How much do they have in reserves? Are there any outstanding assessments? You know, et cetera, so that the buyer understands, like, this is what I'm buying into, right? Because they're buying this property subject to the HOA and they will always be bound by what's in the HOA. Which is why the buyers have the right to terminate within 3 days of receiving the HOA documents, because they may read something in there that they don't like, right? Like, oh, I can't add a flower bed, or oh, I can't park my RV out front, or I can't paint my house pink, or whatever. So that's why the buyer has a very open-ended right to terminate upon receipt within 3 days of the HOA documents, which is why at Briggs Freeman, we say as a best practice, you should order, when you get a listing that has an HOA, you should go ahead and order the HOA documents and the resale certificate. Because then you can deliver it up front and the buyer has to acknowledge receipt and they don't have that like open-ended out. Right? Does that make sense? And I will tell you, like, that's one of the best perks of working with Momentous is that, like, I just had this listing that's in an HOA and Randy and Ruth ordered the HOA documents for me and I delivered it to the buyer and they didn't have that out. Randy and Ruth and Momentous, they'll pay for it up front and then obviously they just get reimbursed at closing. A lot of title companies will be like, we're not ordering it until you give me your credit card. And the listing agent has to give the credit card or the seller has to give the credit card. And that's just not like a luxury experience. So any questions about HOAs? It's not like the most fun topic, but it's important for us to understand. And we're going to go over that document. Here it is. So this is the addendum if your property is in an HOA that you have to fill out. And this is where you need to be strategic as a listing agent. So, you know, sometime every once in a while, the buyer may not require delivery of the subdivision information if they live in the HOA already and they're just moving around, like that you might check that box, but very rarely probably. So in the first one, it says, yeah.
I just have a quick question too. I've got a situation where there's a voluntary HOA. Nothing is required as far as dues, but they have some agreements, neighborhood agreement, more or less. How do I deal with that? Because I'm not required to have this form.
Well, yeah, I mean, if it's a voluntary agreement, I don't know how that they could enforce that against someone who didn't want to comply. If it's not mandatory, if it's not mandatory.
But people still like to see those kind of things, so that would be under the due diligence documents.
I would, and you can, I mean, if you can say, again, if it's not mandatory, they can't force a buyer to comply with it. But if the seller was like, yeah, I would like to share because this is what we do in the neighborhood, absolutely you can share, but you don't have to if it's not mandatory. Like these are mandatory because they're recorded in the real property records and like encumber the property. It's voluntary. Yeah. That might be something that everyone likes to do, but that's not like required. It's not encumbering the property like this is. Does that make sense?
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. So here, I'm just going to read this paragraph once. So within blank days after the effective date, usually at least 10, because that's how long it takes these HOA companies to get them back, seller shall obtain, pay for, and deliver the subdivision information. If they deliver it, then buyer may terminate within 3 days after they receive it or prior to closing, whichever occurs first. And the earnest money will be refunded, right? So it's a very open-ended out. They don't have to give a reason, they just can terminate. And then it says if they do not receive it, then buyer can terminate the contract and get the earnest money back. And in this case, the language is the same. It's just that the buyer is paying for it. And it says if buyer, due to factors beyond their control, is not able to obtain it within the time required, then they can terminate the contract if the HOA is non-responsive or something like that. So those are the differences between those two. But like I said, it's a very open-ended out. And then this is the one that I used when I ordered the resale certificate upfront and delivered it. Like in my listing, I checked this box here. The buyer has received and approved the subdivision information before signing the contract, and they do or do not require an updated resale certificate. So resale certificates do expire. I think usually after 60 days, the HOA will tell you, but to get it, if you order it in advance and then your listing sits for 60+ days, I think it's usually a nominal fee to get it renewed, like $75 or something. It's not a huge expense. So risking having to pay to have the resale certificate renewed, I think makes sense, given that you're removing like the buyer's whole ability to terminate kind of for no reason. So I always say, go ahead and order it up front. So then that's how that works. Does anyone have questions about that? Okay, so then this is an important part too. So this is fees and deposits for reserve. So a lot of HOAs charge a transfer fee, right? Because they have to update who the owner is and update contacts, blah, blah, blah. So this says buyer shall pay any and all association fees, deposits, reserves, and other charges associated with the transfer not to exceed blank. And seller shall pay any excess. So if you, as a listing agent, have not done your homework and you don't know what the transfer fees are, then, and the buyer's just gonna put $100 or $150. But if the transfer fees are substantial, then you're costing your seller that money, right? So you need to know what are the transfer fees. And when you get the resale certificate, you can see it. But I mean, Ralph just had one where the transfer fees in a condo were $15,000. And if he had let the buyer just write in $100, that would have been very expensive. So you need to know, the one that I just did, this HOA in Colleyville, it was $375 and the buyer wrote in $150. So I negotiated back and said $375 and then they were fine with it. So you just need to know that, as a best practice, which is why when you get a listing in an HOA, you need to do this homework upfront. Question?
You know, can I speak to that? I live in a condo. I always try to call the property management company and ask what they charge, because 9 times out of 10, if it's a condo building, there's going to be 2 months reserves. Or if it's a townhome that has amenities, it'll be 2 months reserves plus the transfer fee, and then sometimes a registration fee. Because what happened was when the rules changed and said that the max that a property management company could charge for like the transfer stuff, I think the max was $375, but before some were charging $500. They went back and created other fees. So
Yes.
I just do this is how you write a contract for condos, and I always include that number because then I have to add in our like PIDs if there's a PID, and then our square footage and stuff. So I don't have the time for an agent who doesn't know condos. So I just do this is what you have to put on the contract.
Yeah, and I think that what she's saying is she puts kind of that addendum package together and like post-its that agents that want to write an offer can just pull it down and put it in as part of their offer, and it's written the way that JB wants it, which I think is very smart. And I did not do that in this one with the HOA resale certificate, but I should have just said, check this box, $375, and then check this box. And this says the buyer does not require, but the title company does, like who's paying for it. And then obviously that's negotiable. So any questions about this? It gets tricky with HOAs. You guys just need to be knowledgeable, which is why you're here. Okay. Third-party financing addendum. What time is it? We're good. So I go over this document all the time, but it's really important. And I do find that like even very experienced agents, like don't understand necessarily all the nuances in this document. Plus there was a change about a year ago that we'll talk through. So there's 2 big sections. Paragraph 1 is it talks about the type of financing the buyer has has to make every reasonable effort to apply for, right? So that's the first section. The second part is the main part is the contingencies. So first, if you have a buyer and you're not sure if they're going to do conventional or FHA, check both boxes. Because if you are in conventional and then you switch to FHA, technically you should revise this if you want to keep the protections for your buyer. Does that make sense? Because the buyer is saying in the contract that they will apply for this type of financing and make every reasonable effort to obtain approval. So I would do both if they're not sure yet. And I would also ask the loan officer, what number should they put in here? It's like, oh, this buyer is financing this amount in either, 15, 30 years. What is the interest rate? And then how many points are they going to pay? So have the lender help you fill this out. And if you're writing an offer, you should definitely be in communication with your buyer's lender, and they should have this information. We've actually heard from the SLS guys that we're getting more buyers where they're writing offers, but they haven't gone through the approval process. And a lot of them haven't even gone through the pre-qual process, which is pretty risky as a buyer's agent, in my opinion, and definitely not the way we should operate. So in a perfect world, your buyer has gone through, is approved, right? Like they're really ready to go. And that makes you, your buyer, stronger when you're submitting it to a listing agent. And we'll talk about that. So these are the different types of loans. The one that I want to point out here is other financing. This was the new provision that got added in 2022. And it's basically, if it's not any of these other loans, but it's like a line of credit from their private wealth manager, or even like a loan from mom and dad or whatever, like this gives you the ability to say to the listing agent, like, hey, like we are actually getting a loan. But there's no contingencies on this loan. So it's like, don't be surprised when an appraiser comes. Because a lot of people, at times people will just write it as cash. And then they're actually getting a loan, and the appraiser calls the seller and calls the listing agent, and the listing agent and the seller get really mad. They were like, we thought this was cash. So what you can do is you can fill out the terms here. And then this last sentence says buyer does or does not waive all rights to terminate the contract. So if you said the buyer does waive the right to terminate, then that means there's no contingency on appraisal, insurability, anything like that. So if you submit an offer that says buyer is getting financing, but they waive 2B, and you check this box that it's not subject to buyer obtaining approval, then you're basically saying like, we're getting a loan, but there's no contingencies on it. Does that make sense? It's just, this just helps us in those situations where it's like a unique kind of loan that's not conventional, but you want to disclose that that's what's happening. Okay, so paragraph 2, this is where the contingencies lie. So approval for the financing is deemed to have been approved when both buyer approval and property approval are obtained. This says time is of the essence, which means we must strictly comply with the dates. So buyer approval is the first one. You're either saying like, yes, the buyer's not approved yet, so they have to go through the process, and we're going to check this box, and it's going to take the lender this many days to get them approved. I received a contract the other day, and it was 21 days. And as the listing agent, I was like, no, that's too long. Like if your buyers still need 21 days to get approved, it means they've done very little legwork upfront to go through the approval process. And so to me, that meant that they were a risky buyer. If they had said, oh, we need 7 days because we have one document the underwriter is still reviewing, then that would have been fine. So you need to know from your lender what's the right amount of days, because you don't want to put too short of days and then the lender be like, I don't have what they need. And either because the lender might be slow or the buyer's not getting the lender their document, but you need to talk to the lender about how many days do they really need. And I kind of pushed when we got that offer. I said to the buyer's agent, I said, was the buyer in contact with their lender? Like, can I talk to them? Can I talk to them? And he was like, oh no, the lender's great. Like, don't worry about it. And that alone to me was like a red flag, that he wasn't like, yeah, absolutely. The lender will call you and tell you where we are in the process and why they need 21 days. And he did not say that. So I was like, yeah, this agent was not very good. And it really affected their buyer. The buyer did not get the deal because the agent was not good. In fact, he wrote the offer on like the old contract form, which was, it's old. So anyway, so you either check this box and say, yes, it's contingent on the buyer obtaining approval, or you check this box and you say no. So one thing you need to see here is that if the buyer doesn't, it's basically a pretty open-ended out for this many days, because all the buyer has to say is I didn't qualify, and that's it. The lender doesn't have to write a letter. There's no reason that needs to be given. They just have to say buyer didn't qualify for financing and they get their earnest money back, okay? But if you check this box, there's no contingency on the buyer getting, so that's obviously what a seller wants to see, okay? So now separate from that contingency is a different contingency on the property being approved. And this one is the buyer has up to 3 days before closing to terminate for the property not getting approved, but they also have to have the lender put in writing why it didn't appraise, and here's a copy of the appraisal, it's not insurable, and here's why. So this one is easy to fudge and just say buyer didn't qualify, 2A. 2B is not easy to fudge because the lender has to write a note and say why. Notice of termination and a copy of a written statement from the lender setting forth their determination. Any questions there? People get confused on that all the time. Or people will say, I need to get the appraisal done in this many days. It's like, no, you don't. You have up until 3 days before closing to terminate due to that. Questions?
I have a question, I'll back on the conventional financing real fast, Serene. If, on the interest rate, say you put, 7.5% and it winds up being, they only get 8%.
Mhm.
Later on down, interest rates change, they haven't locked in. Is that technically an out for the buyers if it exceeds?
I mean, it's a good one, and it's a gray area, and people ask me this all the time, and sometimes agents are like negotiating really hard back on like this percentage, and I'm like, yeah, I mean, at that point, if you're getting contentious, it's gonna be feisty anyway, and no title company is gonna release the earnest money without both parties signing off. So, I would, that's why I asked the lender to put a number that they're actually comfortable with, so that you don't have this issue. But
It's
that's,
never come up, but I've always just wondered, like, if,
yeah, I mean, I think arguably, yes. Yes, right? Because you're saying what's the what's the rate, what's the terms, what's the points? And if they can't get there, then arguably, I think that that's an out, because the buyer is not going to get approval on these terms. You just have to get it done in this many days. Does that make sense?
yes, thank you.
That's why I said, like, if you apply with conventional, you write your offer with conventional and they switch to financing, there's no out there, because you know, we said the buyer was going to try to get approval based on these terms, and these are different terms. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. So here, this is in FHA or VA, you need to just put the sales price in this blank. And then here, I want to just point out to you guys in paragraph 5, buyer authorizes buyers lenders to furnish to seller or buyer or their representatives information relating to status of approval, which means that you as the listing agent can speak directly with the loan officer. It's right here in writing. And then it also says seller and buyer authorized buyer's lender, title company and escrow agent to disclose and furnish a copy of the closing disclosures and settlement statement. So we can get both sides regardless, and the other side can get both sides regardless. So questions about that? Just want to make you guys aware of that. We'll keep going. Okay. So this is the right to terminate due to lender's appraisal. This is if you have financing, and in 2B, you obviously, in 2B of the financing addendum, you have the right to terminate because it doesn't appraise. And so agents were writing in like property must appraise for blank, which is not good legal language. And obviously we need this whole huge document to accomplish that. So they created this document, and basically this is a full waiver, which is what obviously the listing agent and the seller want to see, that buyers waiving the right to terminate due to the appraisal. So if the appraisal comes in way low, it doesn't matter. The buyer is saying, we will make up the difference. Now, as a buyer's agent who's writing an offer, before you fill this document out, you need to talk to the lender, because you don't want to say total waiver and then the buyer doesn't have enough cash to actually make up the difference. So you need to talk to them and see, like, what is that number? And then if the lender's like, yeah, like they could not write a check for $75,000 extra dollars because it's going to mess up all their other, you know, parts of their loan and their balances and ratios, then you can do a partial waiver and say it has to appraise for at least this much. Does this make sense? I feel like I talk about this document all the time and you guys are probably bored. I can give you specific examples, or are we good here with these two? Anyone? So here, so this one's saying if it's $1 million,
Oh, shit.
I can't hear you. Okay, I'm just gonna do it. So if this one says it's a total waiver. So if it's a $2 million property and the buyer says we don't care, and then it appraises for 1.5, then the lender, if they're putting 20% down, is only gonna loan them 80% of 1.5, and the buyer has to pay, you know, their 20% as well as the 500 that gets them to the purchase price, right? So that's a full waiver, and it's just risky for the buyer to do it, but that might be fine. The partial waiver, they may say, okay, it was $2 million property. As long as it appraises for 1.75, then we're good, right? And if it appraised only for 1.75, then the buyer would be responsible for, the lender is going to finance 80%. The buyer is responsible for their 20% of what it appraised for, 1.75, plus the 250 to get them to the purchase price, which is why you need to talk to the lender and make sure they're not saying they can afford things that they can't really afford. Does that make sense? Maybe, kind of, not really. Call me if you really get in a pickle or have questions about how to walk through this when you're doing it. Agents call me about this one all the time.
Zareen, when do you use it? When do you use this form? You add it when you're saying they're gonna get a loan?
So you can, if you cannot use this with FHA or VA. The consumer does not have the right to waive the appraisal with those types of loans. We do have language that if you really want to try to waive the appraisal, we can stick into the contract. It is not enforceable, but we have it. So with conventional financing, if the buyer is waiving if the buyer says, we're getting go back here. You know, if you put a third-party financing addendum, and obviously the buyer has the right to terminate up to 3 days before closing if it doesn't appraise. So you want to say to the seller, like, we acknowledge there is a chance that this property might not appraise at this price point. And so we're going to waive our right to terminate due to the appraisal. And this is what that looks like. It's a full waiver. We don't care what it appraises for. We're bringing the cash and we're going to buy it. or it's a partial waiver saying, as long as the appraised is for this much, then we'll buy the property. So you only use it if the buyer wants to waive their appraisal, their right to terminate due to appraisal. It makes the offer stronger to the seller, right? It's just more risky for the buyer if the property doesn't appraise. So that's when you use it. And then this situation, paragraph 3 is different. The only time you use paragraph,
Lorraine,
yes,
I guess something hit out here where I am. Sorry, could you just repeat that?
sure.
You
So
went- It went
you-
blank.
You use this document when you don't want the right to terminate, when you want to waive your right to terminate due to the appraisal not coming in. If you're in multiple offers and it's a $1.5 million property listed and you're at 175 because you wanted to win, but you don't think it's going to appraise there, then you add this document and you're telling the seller, even if it doesn't appraise, we're going to still buy the property and the buyer will make up the difference in cash. So that's when you use this document.
So when your buyer can meet the gap, then you use this.
Yes, and you
Okay.
need to talk to the lender about whether the buyer can meet the gap. If the buyer can't meet the gap, don't waive the appraisal.
Okay.
So.
But you add this to your
Yeah.
third-party finance addendum.
Yeah, we can connect about this one offline if you have more questions.
Okay, thanks.
So this paragraph 3, you use in the circumstances where your buyer is putting so much down, the lender is never going to say, we don't care that it appraised, right? Because the lender wants it appraised so that they know that they're loaning money and are well secured by the value of the property. So if you're buying a $1 million property and the seller is putting $700,000 down and is only financing $300,000, the lender isn't going to care if it appraises only for $800 because they're loaning $300,000 on a property worth $800,000 and they're well secured. Does that make sense? So this is the situation where the lender would be like, we don't care that it didn't appraise for $1 million, but the buyer may care that it didn't appraise for $1 million because they're like, we don't want to put $700,000 cash into a property that's only worth 600,000, right? So they may put a number here that the buyer is comfortable saying, as long as it appraises for this much, then we're comfortable with that. Does that make sense?
Okay. Yes,
So you only use this third part if your buyer is putting so much down that the lender's not going to care what it appraises for. Okay. All right. Okay, so this is actually the interesting part of the class where we're going to talk about like the ins and outs of negotiating and what you can do and what you can't do. Because I think there's a lot of like realtor urban legends out there. So let's just talk through it. So, you know, when you write an offer, you write the offer on paper and you submit it usually, on the actual contract forms that the seller can see all the terms you're offering. And then they don't necessarily counter back and edit the offer and send it back to you. They might, but a lot of times people go back and forth verbally or in writing, and that's acceptable, but you have to be careful, right, guys? Be careful about negotiating over email or text. I remember them, like 3 different situations where our agent calls in a panic because they're like, ooh, I feel like what do I do here? Because they said like, we have a deal, or this is great, or we're agreed. You have to be careful. You can say that thing. You can say, we will have a deal once we put this in writing and everyone signs off on it, right? Because there is case law out there that says an email or a text constitutes a writing, and that was a binding contract, right? But you don't want to do that. You want to make sure everything gets actually signed off on by the party. So be really, really careful. Don't say we have a deal. You can say we will have a deal once we put this on paper and everyone signs off on it. Then we have a deal. Where a seller is agreeing to buyer's terms, once everything gets put in writing, will be executed, right? You're letting them know like this text or this email is not an agreement. It's saying we're agreed to all the terms, but we got to get it in writing now. Does that make sense? Just be careful. There is a document called Seller's Invitation to Buyer to Submit a New Offer. And this you can use. You can basically say like, we're rejecting your offer, right? Seller does not accept the above offer, but if you want to resubmit, these are the terms we would like to see. So you're basically countering them and telling them what you want without sending them a document that they could sign and put you under contract. And you might use this as a listing agent if you're in a situation where we put it on the market on Thursday, we got an offer on Thursday night, but the seller wants the property to stay on the market over the weekend to see what other offers we can get. You could use this and say like, we're rejecting your offer, but these are the terms we want to see if you want to resubmit it. Does that make sense? And that way you're not like formally countering in writing where the buyer might sign off on it and put it under contract. Does that make sense? So that's just a good document to know that exists. And then this is another one, withdrawing an offer. This can be done verbally, but you should definitely follow it up in writing to make sure that the time is documented. This happened to me once. You guys probably all heard this story if you've taken classes before, but I had a listing, we were negotiating back and forth. It was a very difficult negotiation. We finally agreed. I sent the paperwork to the buyer's agent to sign, and then I got on a plane to San Francisco. And when I landed in my inbox, I had a second offer. And so I called the seller and said, what do you want to do? And they were like, yeah, absolutely. Like, let's do highest and best. So I called the first buyer's agent and I said, we're withdrawing our offer. And we're in multiple offers now. So send me your highest and best. And then I sent an email that said the same thing so that we had the time documented because I didn't want her to send it back to me before I had, rescinded the offer, the counter offer to her. And she was so upset because she's like, I have it all signed off on. I have the checks and everything. But you guys have to remember, delivery is the final component. So until you deliver the paperwork back to the other agent, it's not executed, even if you have it signed and have the checks and everything. This was back, obviously, when we did checks. But the agent, ultimately what ended up happening is the two buyers, we did highest and best, and the original buyer, who literally had the paperwork signed, ended up paying $25,000 more to get the property because their agent didn't just forward me the email back that with the executed deal. So just be careful. That's like the craziest version of that story. But this is another, you don't have to do this. A lot of times in these situations, like time is of the essence and a simple email will suffice. But this says, this notice is to confirm that seller has withdrawn all previously submitted offers. This withdrawal was committed orally and, in this writing. So that's this is a form that exists. You don't have to use it. Generally speaking, you're like in a rush and just a plain old email will suffice. I sent this happened to me actually last week with this other deal too. I sent an email that said like seller is, withdrawing their counter offer to you. We got another offer and now please send us your highest and best. And it made the buyer's agent really mad. And I'm like, sorry, dude. Okay. So now let's talk about like any questions about this back and forth. Is this helpful? I can't see you guys because my stupid third screen isn't working. So don't see you nodding or looking confused. Okay. I'm going to take silence as tacit acceptance. So standard terms. So title policy, people will say like it's standard for the seller to pay or whatever. I think we've kind of gotten away from that, but generally speaking that it's negotiable. And whoever, you can't make an offer contingent on using a specific title company if you're not going to pay for it. So if you really insist on a specific title company and the other side really doesn't want that, like whoever's paying for it has the right to choose. That's how it goes. So crossing out promulgated terms in the form, this can be done, right? But you cannot do it. Like if your client is an attorney and they're like, I don't want a special general warranty deed, I want a special warranty deed, and they send you an email saying cross out general and write in special, you can do that if you have written instructions for them. Or if you want something in writing, call me or Angela and let us write it and send it to you in an email so that you have a writing from an attorney and then you can stick it in there. This happened to one of our agents last year. They got in trouble for practicing law without a license because they wrote in terms that their client had like dictated to them over the phone, but there was no text message with their client saying write in this language. It was really stupid and it was really bad language. So please don't do that. Call us. You have 2 attorneys you can call to like get language written, even if the language seems very basic, like just do it. Please don't practice law. And then same thing, if your client wants you to add something, like as long as you have it in writing from someone else, like this is what I want you to do, a party, the actual party or an attorney, you can do that. Does that make sense? So, if another agent on the other side says, oh, you can't do that, or that's void, or you're practicing law, like there are times you can do it. You just have to have the language from an attorney, or if the client has specifically instructed you to in writing, right? You need that writing. Okay. Moving on. So what time is it? 9:45. Closing date extension. So if the closing date is going to be missed because of the buyer's loan, you have 2 choices, and it depends strategically what side you're on, what you want to do. So you can amend the contract to extend the closing date, and that gives the lender like the more time. Or after the closing date, the buyer is in default. Doesn't mean the contract is void. It doesn't mean the contract is terminated. They're just in default. It's still a valid contract. You will notice in our contract in paragraph 9, closing date is not an of the essence date, meaning strict compliance with that deadline. It's not a thing. So they do actually have a reasonable amount of time after the closing date to perform. So if they miss it by a day, is that reasonable? Probably. Like at some point, it's like, what is not reasonable anymore? If they miss it by a day, but the seller has a contingency, like it's not a question that we can decide. That's a question of fact that a court of law would have to decide. But just know that the buyer has a reasonable amount of time after closing to perform. They're not like void, they're not out of contract. Agents will say that, that's not right. It's just, at some point they're in default because they haven't performed, but they're not immediately in default because it's not an of the essence provision. Is that confusing or does that make sense? I have a really good TAR FAQ that explains this. If you ever get sideways with someone about it, I can send it to you and you can send it to them. But basically, the buyer can say like, this is just a short delay and I have a little bit, if it's just the next day, the seller can't be like, oh, we're not showing up. It's the day after closing. Like, that's not reasonable, most likely. How do we- Yes.
This is Eric. Hey, how are you?
Hey.
What if the buyer, like if we're on the list side, the buyer is not performing, like they're not going to close and they have no other excuse other than saying, oh, we just want more money. We want a bigger credit. We want this other than, financing or anything else. They're just requesting, they're just being a bully.
Yeah, so then, I mean, they, at some point before, they like signed this paper that has 4 corners and says what it says, and they are bound to that contractually. They can't just like try to be a dictator and unilaterally change the terms of the contract and not show up to closing. At some point after closing, if they refuse to perform under the terms that they've agreed to, like they are in default and the seller can say like, we're keeping your earnest money. This is not reasonable anymore. So the buyer, neither party has the right to unilaterally change the terms. So they can't just say, oh, we feel like we made a bad deal, so we're not doing it. Because then arguably at some point past the closing date, if they still haven't performed, they are in default and that is not reasonable. And the seller can argue to keep their earnest money. Now, our contract, it doesn't really allow for either party to get the earnest money until ultimately there's an agreement, which is super annoying. And it used to be written better and then they changed it. So there's not a whole lot you can do there other than wait them out. And at some point be like, you're really in default and we're keeping the earnest.
Yeah. Okay. We had that happen. I guess it was last year. Someone they should actually showed up to close and just sat in the lobby and said, okay, we're not going to close until we get X and we're just going to sit here.
Who was it? Like, if that happens to you, call me because I'll call the manager and be like, this is absurd. And like, that's insane. I'm sorry. I'm sure that was really annoying.
Yeah. Anyway. Okay, cool. Thanks.
Yeah. So one thing that you guys need to remember is be strategic on the listing side. If you have a buyer who's been flaky and they keep missing their deadlines and they always are asking for more time and then they ask to extend the closing date, if you agree to that, you're basically giving them, like, we have the closing date and then we have a reasonable amount of time past the closing date and then we have an unreasonable amount of time past the closing date, right? So if you keep extending the closing date, you're just giving them more time you're extending the time of reasonability, right? So at some point you just have to say no and call their bluff, right? And then they get further and further past the date and it changes from reasonable to unreasonable. Now, unfortunately, there's no guideline that says it's this many days, right? It's a gray area, but every time you extend the closing date for the buyer, you're giving them more reasonable time. Does that make sense? So you may not want to, and that doesn't mean that you're not going to close. It just may be that you're holding the buyer's feet to the fire to get the loan done. I had this conversation with some of our North agents not too long ago. I was like, why are we continuing to give them extensions? Like, call their bluff, don't extend, make the lender get the deal done. And ultimately they did. Does that make sense? Okay. All right. Okay. So now effective date. So obviously, the effective date is the date that the last of the 2 parties signs and delivers the contract to the other party. So there's some strategy here, and we'll talk about it. So fill it in upon final execution. And if there's if there's ever a question about the effective date, discover it and clarify it in writing with the other side ASAP. Like you don't want to wait. You have a 7-day option. You don't want on the 7th day for you to be like, today the option expires, and them to be like, no, wait, tomorrow the option expires. Like as soon as it goes under contract, have the discussion. Does that make sense? And the reason that I bring this up is that sometimes agents will put like in DocuSign, like the date that their client signs, they'll just drag it here and that becomes the effective date. But if they didn't deliver it until the next day, technically the next day is the effective date. But the contract says the previous day. So you have to be mindful of that. And there's some strategy too, right? Like the deal I just did, the sellers got the counter offer to the buyers at like 7 p.m. and that buyer's agent then had to decide, do I have my buyers sign it now? And today is the effective date, and we're kind of losing a full day of the option because we're going to send it back to them at 9 p.m. Or do I hold it overnight and then send it back to her? And then we have another day, but there's also the risk that they get a way better offer overnight. So you have to be strategic. Does this make sense? Hopefully this is not confusing and it's just helpful things for you guys to think about. Sometimes it's not an issue, sometimes it is an issue. If you're in a situation where there might be multiple offers, it's like, dude, let's just get it executed and get it back to them and be under contract. If it's not, maybe you want to wait overnight and then send it back. Maybe I'm an overthinker. Not maybe, for sure I'm an overthinker, but I would like to call it being strategic. Okay, so here's an example. So, and it's confusing, so pay attention. So the buyer makes a written offer through his agent to the listing agent on May 15th. And then the listing agent delivers the offer to the seller on May 16th, which I don't know why they would do that unless it came in like 11 p.m. They should have done it right away. So the seller signs the offer as submitted on May 17th and delivers it to their listing agent on May 18th. And then the listing agent emails it to the buyer's agent on May 19th. And the buyer calls the buyer's agent on May 20th and informs them that the buyer has accepted the offer. So what is the effective date in this deal? I'll give you a minute.
19th, right?
Yeah, May 19th, right? The date that the one party delivers the executed contract to the other party is the effective date, May 19th, right? And shame on both of those agents. Okay, don't be that agent. Which you guys are not. Okay, so why is having the effective date important, right? Because most of the key dates in the contract count from there. And what do we do with this information? Create a critical dates timeline so you can track all deadlines and manage the deal and expectations. I always say, like, we're the quarterback of the deal, right? Like we're talking to the lender, we're talking to the buyer, we're talking to the agent on the other side. Like it's our job to keep track of everything. For sure. Because that's our job. How do you track it? Put them in your calendar, obviously. If you work with Casey, she's amazing. She creates a critical date timeline and then she'll put the deadlines into your calendar and into the buyer's calendar. She'll send you calendar invites so you can see when the deadlines are. It's really helpful. Casey and Natalie, they're our transaction coordinators. And then also write your client an email up front with the dates included and then remind them as the dates approach and make sure the appropriate steps are happening. I had an agent, they're not with us anymore, in our North office who their buyer put a lot down and then they just totally missed the date of their buyer approval on their financing. And it was a huge problem and they lost their earnest money because the agents, it's our job to keep track of dates, guys, right? Like we do this all the time as our career and are hopefully doing multiple transactions per year. Most people do this once every few years, if that. Like they're not going to keep track of this stuff. That's our job. That's why we get paid. Okay, section 5 and option and earnest money. Okay. Delivery of option and earnest within 3 days, buyer will deliver title company at the title company's address, this much earnest money and this much option fee. Guys, I just had last week I had my second situation where the agent mixed up earnest and option. And they put, actually they were going back and forth and then they had negotiated a different amount of earnest money and the buyer's agent, who did not work for us, thank goodness, wrote the new amount of earnest money as the option fee. So they had 14,000 as the original earnest money amount and 18,000 as option fee when they meant to put 18,000 as earnest money and like $1,000 as option fee. So technically their buyer was on the hook to deliver 32,000, 18,000 of which was option. So that was a huge mistake. So please, we had another one where our agent mixed up the two and ended up ultimately, and then her buyer terminated and the seller was like, too bad, so sad. You put a large sum as the option fee and we're keeping it and it was expensive to save. So please be mindful of that. And then this is additional option money. You know, this says if the last day to deliver the earnest, option, or additional earnest is a Saturday, Sunday, or legal holiday, then the time to deliver it is extended to the next day, right? So you have 3 days, but the weekends count and holidays count unless it ends on the weekend or a holiday, and then you go to the next business day. Okay? And then termination option. You'll say time is of the essence here, which means you have to strictly comply with all of these dates. For nominal consideration, the buyer is paying the option fee, then they have the right to terminate by 5 p.m. on this date. And then I'm gonna point this out, if the buyer fails to deliver the earnest money within the time required, then seller may terminate this contract. And the reason that we do that is because back in the day when we didn't have this provision, there were lots of investors who would write their offers and they would say no option, which looks really attractive, but then they would never deliver the earnest money. And the sellers were basically stuck in this contract with this buyer who hadn't performed and they were stuck. So now this provision says if you fail to deliver your earnest money, then the seller has the right to terminate. And now if the buyer delivers it on the 4th day and the seller hasn't terminated, then we forget about it and we're back to like being good. But it's basically a race. Like if the buyer doesn't do it in time, as soon as it's past that 3rd day, then the seller has the right to terminate. But if the buyer does it late, then they stay under contract because the seller didn't terminate. Does that make sense?
I have a question.
Yeah,
I don't know why I didn't think about this. So this says here, if the failure to timely deliver the option fee, the buyer shall not have the unrestricted right to terminate. I had a buyer terminate within 24 hours. They were even trying to schedule an inspection and they never paid the option or the earnest money.
yeah. That's a good question. And it does happen. And it just in fact happened to me last week on the deal. And our agent was super mad because she's like, they're trying to schedule the inspection and they haven't delivered their earnest money. So we're not allowing them access. And I'm like, you know, that's not what the contract says. Like, I get what you're doing, but that's not fair for them to inspect until they've given us their option money. But the contract provides that the seller will give the buyer reasonable access. And, it doesn't provide that they'll give them reasonable access once they've deposited their money, especially if it's within this 3 days. So we just have to trust that they are going to deliver that money. But yeah, people are shady and do that. It's annoying.
No. So they terminated, but they didn't give us an option fee. So can we say you really haven't formally terminated because you didn't pay the option fee?
I mean, you can't say that you haven't really formally terminated, but you can say like you owe us the option fee.
Well, they're not going to pay it.
Yeah, I mean, sometimes you deal with, there's bad people in this world, unfortunately. Okay, real quick, I'll keep going. I don't even know. I just have other documents to get through. What's next? Oh, talking about the option fee period. So let me just go through real quickly about who I have for CE credit so that you guys can leave because it's 10 if you need to. Michaela, Eric, Brandy, JB, Donna, Julie, Poj, Allie, Lisa, Gavin. If I did not say your name, but you want CE credit, please put your name and license number in the chat and send $10 on CG Partners, to CG Partners on Venmo. Again, if I didn't say your name, this is the only way that you get credit is if your license number and name are in this chat. So if I didn't say your name, Emily, Allie, Gavin, Lisa, Poj, Julie, Donna, JB, Brandy, Eric, Michaela, Deborah, Bailey. Gotcha. Okay, so you guys that I just said your name will get 1 hour contracts. Everyone else, put it in now or what have you. Poj, if you already did this course, we'll figure something out for you.
Okay.
After. Liz, no, gotcha. Okay, so I'm gonna keep going, but if you guys want to drop off, you're not gonna hurt my feelings. We have this section and just documents to go over. We won't do all the documents. It's a lot of them. You know, counting the option period, we all know you start the day after and that's their first day. And then it's, you know, if the buyer fails to pay the option fee, they don't have an option. It's not that the contract isn't valid, and none of those things. It just means they don't have an option. If they pay on the 4th day, you don't have an option. And then extending the option, you can extend the option. Sometimes you need more time. You must pay some type of additional consideration. People will say, oh, don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. It's like, no, you need to worry about it. It is a big deal, even if it's $5 that the buyer Venmos to the seller, that the that the buyer's agent Venmos to the listing agent, that they drop off at the house, like, please pay some additional consideration under Texas law. For me as an attorney, just do that. Don't say no additional consideration, because technically you do need to pay for that, right? And then an amendment, this is important. This is one that I feel like lots of agents miss. So in the amendment here, typically you, when you're negotiating in the option, you put together this amendment, you're either asking to change the sales price or do repairs or give, you know, a closing credit in 12A1B, but please note that box 7 here says buyer waives the unrestricted right to terminate the contract for which the option fee was paid. So if you're in a 7-day option and you're negotiating back and forth and the buyer asks for all of these things, as the listing agent, you want to make sure that this box is checked. Because otherwise you're agreeing to do all of these things and the buyer is still in their option period and they could come back and ask for more. So you need to make sure that this box is checked. And as a buyer's agent, if you're going to write an amendment and say, we want all of these things, check this box and say, we want all of these things, but also if you give us all of these things, the option goes away, right? So just, I feel like people forget to check that box and it's like really important. Because otherwise the seller may agree to do all of these things and amend the contract and the buyer could still terminate or ask for more up until the time the option expires. Does that make sense? Okay. All right, backup contract addendum. This is where you put the effective date of the first contract, right? And then you're saying either the closing date of the first contract or the option date of the first contract. It really doesn't hurt to just put the closing date of the first contract, and then the buyer can remain in backup until that contract closes or doesn't close, right? And if it doesn't terminate and it does close, then this contract, the backup contract will automatically terminate and get their earnest money back. But if it does terminate, then seller has to notify the buyer immediately. And then the backup contract date changes to the date that they receive that noted. And then, so the backup contract goes into first place if the first contract terminates when the seller gives them notice. And then all of their dates in the contract start ticking. So if you execute a backup contract, you're basically sitting there kind of in your option the whole time, because you can terminate at any time, keep looking for houses, whatever. And then when you get notified that the first contract terminated, then your dates start ticking and you still have the actual option period and all of your other dates tick. So, questions? People always ask what go in these blanks. This is the effective date of the first contract, and this is generally speaking the closing date of the first contract. It doesn't hurt, all it costs the buyer is their option fee, the backup buyer, to like tie up a property and sit in first place. That's why it doesn't, I don't understand why people don't do backup contracts anymore. Buyers who are like, oh, well, we really like this one, but we didn't get it, so we'll keep looking. It's like, well, if you really like this one, put it under backup, even with a small option fee, and then keep looking. You can always terminate, right? Okay. Okay, so this is the addendum for sale of other property by the buyer. You put, you know, this is the contract property you're putting under contract, and then you say, this is what the buyer's house is. This is the date we want the contingency. So the date you think that you'll close by, right, on the sale of the buyer's house. So that the contingency is not satisfied or waived, the contract terminates automatically and the earnest money is refunded to buyer. So you need to watch these dates if you are doing one of these deals. And then if seller accepts a written offer to sell the property, meaning a backup, the seller executes. So you put this on, you put a property under contract with this in place saying the buyer's going to buy this contract, but they have to sell their house first. So the seller is probably going to list that in MLS as active kickout, meaning we have it under contract, but if someone else brings us the backup contract, we can kick out the first buyer. That's what I would do, is I would put it as active kickout to say to buyer's agents, hey guys, still show the property, right? And then, so if they put in a backup contract, then they let the first buyer know, the buyer with the contingency, and the buyer with the contingency has to waive it. Or if they don't want to waive it, then the contract terminates and the earnest money goes back to the buyer. And then the backup contract becomes the primary contract. Does that make sense? And so you have to put a number here. It's usually 3 days, 4 days, 5 days. I mean, 5 days is a long time. I would put 3 days, right? So the buyer has 3 days to waive the contingency. And the way that they waive the contingency is by notifying seller and depositing earnest money with the escrow agent as additional earnest money. So that's why I think you have to put at least 3 days, because if this happens on a Friday and a holiday is Monday, people get into questions about like, when does this have to be delivered? Because the two ways to waive the contingency are notify the seller and deposit this earnest money. So, that's the only way to waive your contingency and say, you know what, like, yes, we still have to sell our house, but we're pending, we're closing in a week, we're comfortable waiving the contingency. If they still have it like actively listed with no takers, they're probably not gonna waive the contingency and they're gonna bow out. Does that make sense? People get really confused about this document. If you're in this situation, call us and we'll walk through it. But it's pretty straightforward and clear once we really read it and walk through it. Okay, this is a good form. I don't know how many agents are aware of it, so I just like to point it out. Is that this is the form that basically says, here's a list of inspectors. We strongly recommend you hire one. Again, this is a Texas Association of Realtors form, which means like our entity drafted it, right? It's favorable to us. It protects us as brokers. So we don't recommend anyone specific. We don't warrant the quality of their work. We recommend that you accompany them so that you can have questions, meaning show up at the end. You don't need to follow them around. We are not inspectors. And then you can put the names of a few inspectors, right? I think this is just a CYA for us. It's a helpful document. I want to make sure you guys are aware. And the buyer can say, I choose to hire or not to hire. They don't have to fill this out. I think just the fact, of course, if they do, that's great and it should go in your file. I think the fact that you deliver it to them and they are on notice and have receipt of this information is helpful to us if there's ever an issue. So it's a CYA document. Okay, notice of buyer's termination of contract. This is between the parties. And then these are the different options why the buyer might terminate. And I will say, I think I've made people paranoid about this because they call me all the time. Please don't be nonchalant in the way that you fill this out, right? Obviously, if it's under the option, you check this box. They can't get approval, you check this box. If the property does not get approved, you check this box, but you also have to deliver the lender's written statement why, right? So there's a difference between those two. Or, you know, this is the HOA. If the buyer got the HOA documents and they don't like it, they can check this box. And then buyer elects to terminate under 7B2 of the seller's disclosure. This is an important one. If you read this is another reason why we recommend getting the seller's disclosure completed up front and making sure that the buyer checks the box that the buyer has received the seller's disclosure. Because if you deliver the disclosure during the contract, the buyer has 7 days from receipt of the disclosure to terminate. So you're basically giving them an open-ended 7-day option from the date you deliver the seller's disclosure, which is why we tell you guys, you must get the disclosure up done, give it to the buyer and make them check the box that they've received it, because you're eliminating that out for the buyer, okay? But this is the situation where you do deliver it during the contract and then the buyer has the right to terminate based on something they read in there. They don't even have to say why. Or this is, you know, buyers elect to terminate under their right to appraisal because it's, you know, maybe you had this partial appraisal waiver, or you checked the third box where we're putting so much down, but it at least has to appraise for this much, but it didn't. Then you check this box, or you say, you know, buyer elects to terminate under 6D because they made title objections that weren't cured. That's another reason. Or 8, and this is the one that you guys use, this one or this one the most. Before you write anything in here, please call me or Angela, because we want to be strategic about what you put in there. We don't want to give you, we want you to write in there a reason that's not actually a valid reason, and then the seller say, well, I'm keeping the earnest money, because that's not a valid reason. So don't be nonchalant about writing something in here. Like, try to use one of these, and if you can't, and you feel like you need to write something in, like, please call me or Angela and let us talk through what goes in that one. Questions? All right, you guys are hanging in there. Again, if you need to leave, you can. Hopefully this.
Hey, Zareen, I
Yeah.
just jump back real quick on the termination of like HOA docs.
Right here.
Yes. I mean, can you give us like an example of what someone could use for that? I mean, like,
Yeah,
I
so
mean,
you don't even have to give a reason, right? All you have to do is check this box, and if you're within the 3 days of receipt, you don't have to give a reason. So that's why I say it's a pretty open-ended out. But so some buyer like may get the HOA docs and be like, oh my gosh, the community pool closes at 9. Well, I like to night swim, so now I don't want this house, right? Like, they don't have to have a reason, but that could be a reason. Or they may be like, I, you know, have an RV parked here in the summer and it
Right.
says, you know, so that might be a reason why. Or the buyer may say like, there's an architectural design committee here and they're gonna review my landscaping plan, like, no way. I want to do natural, you know, like, there might be any reason or no reason. It's just really an open-ended out. They don't.
I
have-
guess on this, on the list side, that's another big benefit of having all those docs ready as early as possible.
Yep.
I guess since I'm bringing that up, so if you ask title to order these docs like ASAP, but then you end up closing with a different title company, like, I
Yeah.
mean,
So what happens in that situation? I mean, obviously, I find most of the time, if like this happened to me, I had Randy open title. I listed them as preferred momentous and I had them order the resale docs. And the first buyer that we put under contract was like, well, we'll pay for the title commitment, but we want to close here. We'll pay for the title. And so we were like, okay, fine, that's like $6,000 to my sellers. Like, sorry, Randy. So what Randy would do is he would transfer it to the second title company and they would reimburse him for what he paid.
okay, got it.
So that's doable. It's not like insurmountable. It's fixable.
Is
Yeah,
that
I know it's not a
typical?
huge expense, but I didn't know if it was a cost. It's, you know, you just eat it and move on.
No, I mean, momentous it's expensive, right? And the fact that they'll, like, that's why title companies are so anal retentive of being like, I need your credit card, or I need the seller's credit card, because most of them won't do that. But we think it's a true benefit. It's like eliminating a huge out.
Yeah, okay, cool, thanks.
Someone else was gonna say something.
So no, Zarina, so that is typical. Other companies would pay you back.
Yes, they should. I mean, if you're a good listing agent and you're like, look, I had Randy do it at Momentous, but these buyers are insisting on you, but he's paid for that. So, you know, Capital Title should reimburse Randy because they're not gonna have to have any costs to order it because Randy's just gonna deliver it to them and say, here's the invoice to pay us back. But then
Okay.
Capital Title may turn around to you and be like, I'm not paying Randy. You need to give me a check, or the seller needs to give me a check, or whatever.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, release of earnest money. This is a good document, obviously. This is where, you know, you deliver your termination and then you also deliver the release of earnest money, how we want it distributed within the option fee. You want all the money going back to the buyer, which is what you put. So you instruct the title company to give all of the money back to so-and-so, or if you sideways and you finally agreed, like, we'll split it, you direct it to give them back, half to buyer, half to seller. And that's how that works. The most important sentence here is that the undersigned buyer and seller release each other, any broker, title company, and escrow agent from any and all liability under the aforementioned contract. Like, this is why we like this document, because it says this deal is over. Nobody owes anyone anything once these funds get distributed. Good? Okay, pretty straightforward, but really helpful. Okay, so now we get into all these addendums regarding residential leases. Let me see what we have left. Fixture leases, hydrostatic testing. Oh, let's talk about these. We can go back to those if you guys want, but this is important. So registration agreement between brokers. This is if you decide to change the commission for whatever reason, you have to fill this out, because obviously if someone is advertised, we're paying 3% in the MLS, but they're only going to pay 2%. You have to put that in writing. And this is what this document does. Registration agreement between brokers. This is also if you are showing an off-market property, like if JB has a hip pocket and Michelle Wood from Compass is like, I'm bringing you the buyer, they should fill this paperwork out beforehand. So, you know, who represents who and who's paying who, how much. This is a registration agreement between brokers. So you use this for off-market deals where there's 2 different brokers involved, or in situations where the commission was advertised in the MLS and it's different than what's advertised in the MLS. Now, obviously, this is all going to change soon because it's never going to be advertised in the MLS anymore. So this will you'll probably get more and more familiar with this document. It's probably also going to change in the coming months. We have not seen that paperwork yet from Texas Association of Realtors, but hopefully it's going to build us all the tools we need to be able to function under these new rules. Good questions? Okay, this
Hey,
document,
Zareen,
yeah,
would you talk about the seller's lease back? Because that one's really a scary one. If you're the seller and you lease back and anything goes wrong, you have to take care of everything.
yes. In fact, we should add that into this class. Although obviously this is too long, and maybe when I renew this class, I'll either make it a 2-hour class or 2 1-hour classes, which would be better for you guys. A 2-hour class, does that sound intimidating to attend, or would you rather have 2 1-hour chunks?
2 1 hours.
1
Okay.
hour.
We'll do 2 1-hours and then maybe we offer them back to back. People could stick around.
Yeah.
Okay. So I will talk about that. I'll pull it up, but real quick, let's go through registration agreement between broker and owner. This is something that you guys who've been in the business for a long time call it the limited showing agreement. And we don't, that document does not exist. This is called, it's a registration agreement between broker and owner, and you use it on FSBOs, on self-represented sellers, or if you don't have a listing agreement, but like if my neighbor would sell their house, but we don't have a listing agreement and I find someone who wants to come see it, I would sign this with my neighbor and say, I'm representing you. Or I'm representing the buyer and this is what this is gonna look like and how much I'm gonna get paid. So basically, if the seller is not represented, you fill this out with them and you say who's gonna get paid who what. And it may be like this, I'm representing my neighbor because I know they would sell for the right buyer and, you know, Tommy Pennington from Compass is like, I have a buyer for your neighbor's house. I could present this to my neighbor and say, hey, I'm gonna represent you for this amount. And Compass is gonna represent the buyer for this amount. And it kind of is like a mini listing agreement, I would say. Or it could just be approach a FSBO and it's a mini buyer's rep agreement in which the owner is agreeing to pay you as the buyer's rep. Done. All right. Okay, hydrostatic testing, don't do it without signing this document saying who's gonna be responsible if damages are caused. And these are the addendums regarding fixtures. If you have a residential lease, in paragraph 4 of the contract now, it says, yes, this property is subject to a residential lease, or is it subject to a fixture lease? And then you have to add this addendum, and it basically says, we'll terminate all the leases, or they're gonna be assigned, and this is how this gets taken care of. It just documents how to take care of these leases, whether the property is being bought subject to these leases, or they will terminate prior to the sale. Same thing with the fixture lease here, if they have solar panels or propane tanks or what have you. There's some fancy footwork here, so as a listing agent, we need to be aware. Okay, so the residential lease, I'll just talk about it while I pull it up. But basically, the seller's residential, the temporary lease back. You want the sellers. Okay. Pulling it up. You guys are really hanging in there. It must be rainy. No one can go anywhere. You're stuck with me. Here we go. Okay. So this is the seller's temporary residential lease, and it does happen a lot. And I will tell you, like, these are risky, right? So, and the longer they are, the riskier they are. So obviously it's a courtesy to the seller to be able to stay and move like after the closing. I don't think this is intended for use, it says right here, for more than 90 days. I think doing a 90-day lease on this flimsy 2-page document is pretty risky. If they're gonna stay for 6 months, they probably need to do an actual residential. It's not probably, they need to. Do not use this form if it's longer than 90 days. I would say always like for both parties, there's risk involved, so make them as short as possible. But we'll just walk through it. So the parties to the lease are the landlord is the buyer, right? Because they own the property, but the seller is going to stay in there as the tenant. And then it says landlord leases to tenant the property described in the contract, known as obviously the house. And then the term is how many days. It might be, you put a date in here, right? So it's the lease commences on the date of the sale and terminates blank. So, you know, if this closing is May 31st, it's going to terminate June 3rd, just to give the seller the time out, or it may terminate July 31st, right? That's less than 90 days, but still a long time. So that's how long the term is. And then it says tenant shall, and sometimes I know agents want to say like 3 days after closing, you can do that. Because sometimes closing dates move, but you should have to be mindful of that. So tenant shall pay to landlord as rent how much per day. So sometimes the tenant's not paying anything and it's a free lease back. Or sometimes you're saying X amount per day. And what the title companies do is they're going to calculate that amount and just include it in. Someone got something to say? Okay. So now this is gonna be my hot take that you guys don't love. So tenant shall pay to landlord at the time of the funding of the sale blank as a deposit to secure the performance of this lease, which means that the seller's gonna give the buyer a credit at closing, that's their security deposit, right? And, you know, that's annoying because at the end of the lease, like the seller and the buyer are in a landlord-tenant relationship, and the seller will have to account to the buyer for anything that they don't refund the security deposit, but it's all, so people are like, oh, that's annoying, I don't wanna do that. But it's also the only leverage that the buyer has, that the seller is gonna like leave the house in good condition or, you know, have it cleaned or whatever. So, I recommend having a security deposit always on the buy side, because that, if you're representing the buyer, because that protects your buyer. It's a little bit of leverage against the seller and not leaving the house like as a total disaster or causing damage when they move or whatever it is, like the bed punches a hole in the sheetrock, like whatever. So, tenant shall pay to landlord at the time of funding. So I recommend a security deposit if you represent the buyer. Not everyone likes to do that because they want to make it as clean as possible. But it basically says landlord may use the deposit to satisfy tenant's obligations under the lease. They will refund any unused portion with an itemized list of all deposits within 30 days after tenant surrenders possession and provides landlord written notice. So this is a landlord-tenant relationship. And if there is a security deposit collected, like you have to follow the terms of this lease, which basically says like, when the seller moves out, they have to say like, this is my forwarding address, I want my security deposit back. And then the tenant, the buyer landlord has 30 days from the date that they receive that information from the seller tenant, that here's what we're giving you back. And that's how like lease security deposit return works as well. So it's kind of painful for everyone, but also it's the only way to protect your buyer. Okay, so utilities. Tenant shall pay all utility charges except blank, which basically means like the buyer is turning off the utilities as of the date of closing. No, the seller is turning off the date of utilities. No, sorry, I'm getting confused. This is why this is confusing. So the seller tenant leaves the utilities in place. And then, except for anything that the landlord is going to be responsible for. But so probably you're not going to say anything, like basically there's, I always say, I think of it this way to agents, when we take a big step back, is that we do seller leasebacks as a courtesy to the seller, right? To give them some time, to make it easier, to make sure that they don't have to move before we know closing is happening, et cetera, et cetera. So I always say it's kind of like an artificial closing date, because really the date that they move, like the seller is responsible for the house up until the date that they move out, even if the closing date was a week before, because that's how this lease is drafted, and we'll get there. So tenant may use the property only for residential purposes. They can't assign a lease. They cannot keep any pets except for obviously right in the name of their existing pets. Tenant accepts the property in its present condition. Upon termination, tenant shall surrender the property to landlord in the condition required under the contract, except normal wear and tear and any casualty loss. So what that means is on the date of closing, the seller's homeowner's insurance is going to go away and the buyer's homeowner's insurance is in place. So if there's a tornado during the lease, the seller is not responsible for that because they don't have homeowner's insurance anymore. The buyer is responsible for that with their insurance. Okay. But if, you know, if the dishwasher breaks during the course of the lease, but it was working at the time of closing and that's what the buyer agreed to, then the seller is responsible for fixing the dishwasher. Does that make sense? Okay. So tenant may not alter the property or install improvements or in any fixtures placed remain the property of the landlord. Pay inspectors, landlord may enter at reasonable time. So sometimes you have sellers and buyers that get sideways and the seller who's saying in the lease back is like, they can't have keys. And it's like, that's not correct. The buyer owns the house. The buyer gets keys. The buyer can access the house at reasonable times. Like it's all here in the corners of the document, but people get like emotional and then call us and it's like all right here. Tenant will comply with all applicable laws, blah, blah, blah. Okay, this is the important part and this is why it's underlined. Except as otherwise provided in this lease, tenant shall bear all expense of repairing and maintaining the property, including but not limited to the yard, trees, and shrubs, unless otherwise required by the Texas Property Code. Tenant shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or omission of the tenant or any person other than the landlord, landlord agent, or invitees. So this is where the risk is, guys, right? Like if the seller has a 2-month lease back and the air conditioning breaks, like whose responsibility is that? Well, tenant shall bear all expense of repairing and maintaining the property. Including but not limited to the yard. They shall promptly repair at tenant's expense any damage to the property caused directly or indirectly by any act or omission of the tenant. So it's like failure to maintain it and then it dies, like it's gray, right? And nobody, the buyer's gonna say, I'm not paying for new air conditioning, and the seller still lives there, and the seller's gonna say like, I don't own this house, I'm not buying you a new air conditioning, right? So it gets really messy. We do have some language that clarifies this that we can stick in there if you are gonna do this. So please ask us for this. And of course, it depends which side you represent, but I would always rather be clear upfront about who's responsible for what. And this is really confusing language. You just kind of have to pray that nothing bad happens during the course of the lease, which is not a good place to be when you're like praying for a result and you haven't like drafted around it, right? Questions about this? Okay. So now tenant indemnifies landlord from all claims or damages. And then insurance, tenant shall each maintain insurance. So tenant has, the seller, since their homeowner's insurance is going away, should get like a temporary renter's policy to protect their content. Note, consult your insurance agent. Because, you know, possession of the property by seller as a tenant may change insurance policy coverage. That, at the end of the day, that should be our big takeaway, is that if you're gonna do a lease back, both parties need to talk to their insurance person and say, we're doing a lease back, what do I need? Okay, that should be our advice. Okay, default. If tenant fails to perform within 24 hours notice by landlord, tenant's in default, termination, terminates the term. If tenant doesn't surrender the property, then they have to pay a holdover fee if they're not moved out in time. I would put a number there, otherwise, I know we want to write offers that look like really super clean, but if you put 0 here, as a buyer, you're potentially really screwing your buyer over. So again, we can't make these decisions, but we have to be able to talk about them with our buyers, that then they can decide, do they want to open this up, themselves up to some liability here and make it super attractive, or do they actually want to put some teeth into this document so that when they do own the property, they have some rights? That's the discussion that we need to have with them, that the buyer can then choose. Does that make sense? Okay. Smoke alarms, tenant waives landlord duty to inspect and repair smoke alarms. I don't know why they don't also waive the flood disclosure, because technically the buyer has to deliver to the seller the flood disclosure form, even though the seller's been living there forever and the seller actually has all of the information. That's right here. So landlord we have to deliver this landlord's floodplain and flood notice, which is really stupid, but is how it is right now. Hopefully they'll change that. You know, the requirements of the property code relating to security devices do not apply to residential lease. So it's not like the buyer needs to go in there and make sure all the security devices and smoke alarms are current. Consult your attorney. This is a CYA for us. I do encourage you to make sure that your clients are reading this document, because this is a document that they will be bound to as landlord and tenant after closing. So please don't just say, this is our lease, like, this is what I recommend we put in there. Don't do it that way. Be like, this is an important document. It gets a little sticky, like, please read it before we decide to do this, whether you're going to be the landlord or the tenant, okay? And then this is where you put notices. You do not want your agent, as the Briggs Freeman agent, to be the only contact information in there. Please put your client's contact information as well, because once they're in the landlord and tenant information, I know we want to be full service, but also like they're a landlord and they're a tenant now, and to some extent they have to own that they're in those roles. Okay, guys, I'm sorry this went over so long. Thank you for hanging in there. Hopefully it was helpful. Jeremy's asking, would it be better to amend the closing date instead of this if it's for less than a week? So typically speaking, it's a good question. I mean, the seller wants to know, like, I've got the money, I can, before they start moving out. Because you might be in the situation where the seller, like, you know, closing date is Friday, so seller spends all week moving, and then the buyer's like, oh, just kidding, we can't close. And that's no good. So that's why sellers want this, generally speaking. And they also, if they're buying another house, they want to get the funds from this deal, purchase the new one, and then have some time to move. It's really tricky to do without this document, so I'm not saying this is a garbage document, you should never do it, you just need to be able to have a really thoughtful conversation with your clients about what this means and what the risks are. And then ask us if you want us to borrow some language to like work around the risks. Okay, thanks, guys. Thanks for hanging in there. Sorry. This was
Thank you.
See ya.